Hello, I'm the Grove Street Lodger, and we're going to look at the books that I read this February. Now, February was quite a quiet month in terms of events. Plays were done, job things sorted out. I was just sort of settling into a quieter new normal, I suppose, and that's reflected in the amount I read as well, I think. We're starting off with the book of Forgotten Authors by Christopher Fowler. I started reading this during the play because it's a dystopian book. It's the kind of book that is good for that kind of thing. Short chapters, self-contained. I didn't have to hold the plot in my head while I was then going to go out and act in another plot. So I did read the whole thing through, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, I like Christopher Fowler anyway. I was a big fan of Roofworld back in the day, and he wrote another book called Calabash I really liked. I never read his Bryant and May books. This was based on a series of things he did for the Times called Vanished Ink or something. Anyway, it was all about authors that have been forgotten. Now, I've read about 7 of these authors already. Some of them I was quite surprised to be on there. Like, I wouldn't have thought that Mr. White, the writer of Once and Future King, T.H. White, old Terence, I wouldn't have thought he would have been forgotten, but he was in this list. So I really enjoyed the little potted histories and the little teasers. As I said, I'd read about 7 of them. There were about 5 I had on my shelves, and then there was a few other ones that I was intrigued by that I did use my Christmas Amazon vouchers to get a few. Very naughty, but there we go. It was very loose and chatty and opinionated. It seemed almost like a companion piece of the 50 books we could do without. It was like 100 authors we could do with. Well, 99, and then he included himself as the 100th. 99 authors we could do with. His tastes are clearly reflected in that. He's into sort of crime fiction and detective fiction and weird fiction, so there was quite a bit of that, a little bit of sci-fi in there. He didn't like sci-fi as much. But it was good. And then he found out just odd little things. Like, I didn't know that Bosie, this is one of the authors that is like justly forgotten, Bosie, the lover of Oscar Wilde, who later doubled down on sort of Catholicism and I wasn't gay really, is buried in my hometown of Crawley. I did not know that. But there you go. I also didn't know that, for example, Private Godber? The old doddery guy from Dad's Army, he was involved in both World Wars as a fighter, and he also wrote books. I didn't know that. Or about the novels written by the man who went on to write King Kong. So, yeah, there was a lot of very interesting stuff and points to the future. And spoilers, the future is going to have some of the books that I found out about in this. So then, play's over. I'm going back to my non-play life, which is a lot quieter because it's not involving going out for 3 hours 3 times a week to practice a play and then be in one, and get back to my novel. You see, my wonderful novel about Samuel Johnson's younger brother. And so to try and get myself back into that world, I read this book here. That's Johnson's Willow, and the book is Dr. Johnson's Lichfield by Mary Alden Hopkins, who I found out one of the things she wrote was one of the very first game books, sort of choose your own adventure books, but then she also wrote this. And it started off as a sort of a little potted history of Lichfield, and it was very interesting, the legends that might have influenced Samuel Johnson. So he believed that Lichfield came from lich, meaning dead, like the Lich Gate in a cemetery, and it was because there's this whole story about a whole bunch of Roman Christians being murdered and that their blood lies under Lichfield. There's also a place of martyrdom from then on as well, and all these sort of ideas of unrest and martyrdom and how they might have played into Johnson's thinking and stuff. And I want to get more of that into the novel, and that's kind of interesting. And then there was a little bit about the Johnson family. She had very little to say about Nat. She just said he may have been a problem child. I don't think he was. I think he was actually probably quite boring and ordinary, but in the book I'm trying to make him more than boring and ordinary because I'm writing the book about him. But then she gets onto what she really wanted to talk about, which was essentially the generation below Johnson. So Johnson's gone off to London, and now around the Cathedral Square, Cathedral Close, you've got people like Erasmus Darwin, and in particular Anna Seward, or Seward, I'm going with. The Swan of Lichfield, she was sometimes called. She was a poet. She was very outspoken. She sounds like a complete pain in the arse. And the book indeed talks about how much of a pain in the arse she must have been, but how much of an interesting pain in the arse, and at least someone who gets things happening. And really what Mary Alden Hopkins wanted to talk about was the drama of this Cathedral Close. Oh, what's this side? Okay. She makes it like this soap opera. There's a man who he comes in, and he comes in a one-wheeled carriage of his own design. This is Edgeworth, the father of Maria Edgeworth, who wrote Castle Rackrent and stuff. And he wanted to talk to Erasmus Darwin about inventions and coaches and things. Then he starts sort of lurking, and he ends up marrying Honora Sneed. And Honora Sneed was an earlier amour for, I've forgotten his name now. Apparently he's very famous in America. This is an American man, she said. As every school child knows. I was like, I've never heard of the guy. But he sort of went off to the American wars, partly because of being dejected by Honora Sneed. And he ended up being caught and hanged as a spy, along with John Andre. Apparently people in America know about him. I hadn't heard this story, but it's a whole romantic story about that. And then there's Seward, who didn't leave his wife, but he ended up living next door to her and had sort of was probably a platonic romance with Anna Seward. And then there's, of course, the bastard Day. Day is a twat. I hate Day. He took two girls out of an orphanage and tried to train them to become his perfect wife, and neither of them were. There was another man who promised Letitia Hawkins? I might have got the name wrong. No, Sophie Streffield. Sophie Streffield, who was someone that Thrale, the man Thrale, not Hester Thrale, kind of fancied. She could cry at will. And she got involved with this man who essentially proposed and was engaged to her, but for when his wife was dead, because she was still alive, it was like, we propose, we engage, we're going to get married when my wife dies, and I won't kill her. And then when she died, he dropped the proposal. So essentially, this book is it's just a gossip column of all the ins and outs of this younger generation. And then Johnson comes back at the end. It was really entertaining. I had great fun with it. So many very complicated stories that were very, very interesting. And I will go back to it to look at some of those again, because they were really good fun. If you want a gossipy guide to 18th century Lichfield, or a guide to the gossip of the Cathedral Close, then this is the book for you. If you wanted a more, for a person writing a novel set in 18th century Lichfield, useful book, maybe not, but very entertaining and very enjoyable. Then I read a book I borrowed from, well, there's this pile at school, and I just picked it up, and it was RF Kuang, and it was Yellowface, and I picked it up because it looked intriguing, essentially. And it was about this woman who, she and this other person were in college together. They were both wannabe writers. One of them was very successful, and the other one less so, was more sort of mid-list. And during the night out, this successful one dies and has an entire first draft of a novel on their desk. And what's more, they don't make copies, they don't send it out to anyone. It was very narratively engineered to make sure that this was the only copy. And so she takes it, and then she claims it as her own, and she changes it. And the most interesting bit actually was when she takes it to the publisher, and all the suggestions the publisher makes, where this book is obviously being changed and made more melodramatic and more romantic and more sort of gone with the wind, it almost seemed like, rather than the more sort of excoriating satire or something that it was originally as. The other thing, of course, the title Yellowface, is that the dead author, the successful author, who was called Athena, she wasn't really Chinese, was she? She was Chinese American, if I remember right. but now she's adopting this story about Chinese labourers in World War One, and how much is she sort of carrying the race and wearing Yellowface, and things just go wrong for her, and you want things to go wrong for her because she's a thief. The whole race thing I found a bit odd, because it was like, shouldn't someone tell these Chinese people stories, and shouldn't it be me? And then she was saying, well, the person who actually wrote it was it wasn't really their story either, but it really wasn't the person who stole it story, because she literally stole it. So race aside, she's stolen the story. It's not her story to tell, because she wasn't interested in it. She just stole it. But there you go. I found it good. I enjoyed it. It was solid. I wasn't like edge of my seat gripped. It was just a nice, decent, solid. Put it as 3-star. Next book I read, I borrowed from the library. Ooh, I don't do that very often. Should do it more often. And this was the last of not His Dark Materials, because that's the first trilogy, and the second trilogy was Book of Dust, the Phillip, Pullman, Lyra stories. It's called The Rose Field, and it had a lot to do, because the last book, The Secret Commonwealth, was unsatisfying, because it was clearly not a finished book in itself. It needed this book to finish it off, and there was a lot about it which was uncomfortable and unsatisfying. I mean, aside from the dodgy romance that Pullman seemed to be trying to introduce between Malcolm and Lyra, despite their age difference, and that he was her teacher and things like this. But also, essentially, all these books are a big metaphor. And in the first one, it ends with God dying. And then the bell sausage was, well, what about pre-monotheistic stuff? What about, there's the Secret Commonwealth, which was implied to be almost like fairy world. Though in this book it became more to be just imagination, but yeah, sort of fairy world and myth. And then the beginning of a Secret Commonwealth book was, well, God's dead, now what? Well, the church is going to keep maintaining its power, because it wasn't really about the religion or God, it was about the power. But also now there's ideas of sort of nihilism and materialism and immaterialism, and Lyra's sort of lost her way, and Pan's gone off to find her imagination. And so this book had an awful lot to do to bring it all together. And I was thinking maybe it hadn't done that, because basically I hadn't heard anyone talking about it. And people have talked about the other books a lot, and this book seemed to have just come out and whiffle away. But I found it satisfying on the level of the metaphor. So they're going to this rose garden, and now sort of the big baddie is not the magisterium, it's not the church. It's this thing that's there called the alkahest, which is an alchemical term for something that dissolves bonds. And there's something coming out of there which is destroying the relationship between people and their demons, which are their souls. And what is the alkahest? And I'll give you a spoiler now, so skip if you don't want to hear it. But it's capitalism. It's money, but not. Well, it is money. It's currency, because they've gone from trading, bartering to currency. But it's more like global currency. It's globalism. And in terms of the metaphor, it makes perfect sense, because what did Western society do after they kind of did away with the idea of God? They turned to the idea of capital, of money. The line must go up. It's and it has had this decaying effect on our relationship with our souls and art and all this sort of stuff. The church might have been very oppressive and squashed out certain expressions of the soul, but very nurturing of others, whereas money just sort of lets it all go hang. And so in terms of the metaphor, it works really well. In terms of the story, it kind of works. It works as long as you're following the story as metaphor, because the ending is no big. They beat the magisterium agents. They find out what the alkahest is, but now there's nothing they can really do. If there's another trilogy, it's just Lyra watching people wither away from their souls as money spreads its evil tentacles. There's no big win at the end of this. There's no god that's defeated. It's just, oh, that's something that we can't do anything against. And so it's quite flat. And yet it's a personal triumph for them because, Pan and Lyra have got together and everything's been sorted for them. But the real danger is just beginning. And he said it's the end of the series. So I suppose it's there to prod people and think, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to nourish our souls in this time of capitalism where everything's just worth something? And that's kind of what the book's about. And as such, it's a lot more satisfying than it could have been. It really worked as a tie-up for this trilogy. But it doesn't have the sort of the punch to the air sort of ending of the last trilogy. And so it's a little bit flat on that sense. I can see why there's not loads of talk about it. Okay, what we got now? We've got Hollow Places by Christopher Hadley, An Unusual History of Land and Legend. This is all about Piers Shonks. I had not heard of Piers Shonks. And so it's all about this legend in Hertfordshire of a local dragon slayer. And it should be right on my alley. It was also antiquarian, weird mythology, strange tendrils of history, somebody obsessively going after one small thing. And it should have all been really me. I should have really loved this book, and I really did not love this book. I described it as pains-giving rather than painstaking. Because I think the big thing is, he doesn't tell us what the legend is before he starts going into it from all these different facets. So we don't know the legend. We just get all these little fragments, and by the end we can piece together what the legend might be and how it might have come about and all this sort of thing. But it needed to start with a telling of the legend. So then you know what you're approaching from all these different angles. As such, it just starts off with 100 pages about a yew tree, about where this yew tree might be, about the history of yew trees, about how to cut down yew trees, about the ecology of yew trees, about field names, about how field names have changed, about the field names of this one specific place in Hertfordshire, about how the map of field names was lost in the war, but then they found a sort of a second copy of it, and that it told them absolutely nothing because the field names have changed. But then they found another map that said that field names were there, and they found the field where the yew tree probably was, but it might not have been there, and if it was there, well, there's no remain of the yew tree anyway, and we don't actually know the significance of the yew tree in the story, because we haven't been told the story. And then there's a grave, and he takes photos of it. And the grave, there's some interesting stuff about the sort of symbolism of the grave and what tombstones were for before the Reformation and how they changed. So there used to be essentially pleas for people to pray for them to get them through purgatory. But then after the Reformation, with this belief in purgatory, they're now reminders of who the person was. And so the iconography on this gravestone changes its meaning, and so the dragon on it and all this sort of stuff. And he takes photos of it, and he looks at photos and goes, "Oh, there's little shells and things in there. That might be Purbeck marble." So now we get a bit where he goes to a man who says, "Yes, that is Purbeck marble." And now we get a history of all the animals and fossils that created Purbeck marble, and the timeline now goes back to something, the Jurassic era, the timeline at the back of the book. And so we find out about how Purbeck marble is formed, and then we find out he goes to where it was mined and who might have made it, and then we find out one possible route it took to get to this place in Hertfordshire, and then another possible route, and then another possible route, and then we're told it doesn't really matter, but it got there anyway, and it might not even been the grave for this guy. And this is it, you see, it's just too many bits. Because we haven't seen the whole at the beginning, it just remains bits. And because he's trying at once to deconstruct this myth, and I think he does a pretty good job of where the myth comes from, that there was this real Piers Shonks who was a local landowner, and that he or his grandson may or may not have fought a legal battle, a trial battle, or just a court case which won some victory for the village, and that the village celebrated him as this good man, and that there was already this weird tombstone there from a previous church that was laid in the middle of the new church, and it might have been Piers, it might not, who knows, but the name got conflated with that, and then that had a dragon on it, so then stories of dragons, and blah 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 blah. And that's all quite interesting. But because we didn't have that story to begin with, we just had no idea what we were looking at through all these tiny pinpricks. So it's just a book of tiny pinpricks, and it's very unsatisfying. And I finished the month with one of the books recommended by Forgotten Authors, Tom's a Cold, a tale by John Collier. John Collier wrote the script for African Queen, which is maybe one of my top 50 favourite films, I suppose. It's a good film, and maybe responsible for The Little Green Parakeets in London, or may not. He also wrote the short story that Little Shop of Horrors was based on. But this, Tom's a Cold, is a dystopia. So it was written in 1933. It's set in 1995, but it's set in a 1995 where World War I has not ended. And so it just kept on going until society, certainly in England, we don't see anywhere else, but presumably Europe at least, if not the whole world, has crumbled and is now essentially Bronze Age. They've got all these remnants of what was there before. There are these city-states in the old bombed-out cities. There are sort of roving bandits. There's these weird inbred half-human children who live in the woods. And then our hero, Harry, is the presumable next chief of a little homestead in a ruined out farmhouse, and they've made it very safe and very quiet. And it's an interesting generational thing. So the older men remember the world before it fell apart. The middle-aged men were the children of the collapse, and they're rough and they're hard and they're just concerned with being safe, and they have the power now. But the younger men have been raised by the older men with this belief in trying to rebuild society, even though they don't really completely understand what society was. And so our hero Harry is sort of almost presented as a King Arthur kind of figure. You know, he wants to create Camelot, essentially, a place where art and beauty and history, and what separates this group of people from the others we hear about, for example, they keep the books and culture and things. So he wants to create this haven of art and beauty and order and security. And what everyone agrees on is that they need more women. So it's all about this plan to essentially do Rape of the Sabines or Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. They're going to go and steal women. And it's what happens after that and all the internecine affairs. And also the place they're stealing the women from is an outpost of a terrible, evil city. This blot on the landscape, this terrible, powerful place. Swindon. there's all these sort of, Swindon is this mythic place of evil. And actually just to the south of Swindon, there's this new fortress that's growing up in Marlborough, which might become a player. And it's a bit of a red herring with all the Swindon and the Marlborough stuff. I almost want a sequel to this to see where it goes next, because it ends not on a cliffhanger, but it ends on a decisive moment, and the reader's got to decide which way it went. And it was really gripping. I do put little star ratings when I put these on the Goodreads, and this is the first 5-star, though really it's 4.5 to be honest. But it was really, really gripping, really interesting. There's just an odd tone and cadence to the thing, sort of almost medieval, but then there's all these references to railway lines that have been just sources of metal and Swindon, big bad Swindon noise. It's a good book, very, very good. So that's February. I feel I've rambled a little bit, but I often do feel that. I guess I'll see when I look back at it. I've started the new month, which actually starts tomorrow, with another John Collier book called His Monkey Wife. So that's a title to conjure with. But I'll tell you more about that in March, and hopefully I'll do lots of other things. I'm not totally sure what. Today I've sorted all my CDs out downstairs, and today I'm sorting out a cupboard. Rock and roll! It's all good. Have a nice time.